welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Redpill, joined by my co-host, Dr. Benway, and we're going to be really honest with you, our dear audience members. Today, we're just not really feeling it. We're sort of like low energy. We're almost Jeb Bush-like, if you will. Because we had both rough days. I mean, like, the time we record these things, it's usually nighttime for Dr. Benway and early morning for myself. And, Benway had a rough day. I had a rough night. We're just not really feeling it. And so we were like, puttering around, like, what the hell are we going to talk about? And we finally lit on T.S. Eliot and, what's his face? Bob Dylan. And, okay, roll with it, Dr. Benway. Help me, save me. I'm drowning here.
Well, no, it was a typical event where, you were bitching and moaning in that Jewish way you have about, oh my God, Bob Dylan won a Nobel Prize. When Bob Dylan won a Nobel Prize, oy vej mir, he's not a real artist. And my response to you was, I do think he's a real artist, but that the difference between me and you is I like T.S. Eliot, and that explains it, because Bob Dylan is an acolyte of sorts, and heavily influenced by T.S. Eliot, explicitly referenced in a number of his lyrics.
Yeah. He's T.S. Eliot monk. He's T.S. Eliot light. He's T.S. Eliot's blowjob provider. He's his fluffer. Yes, we know that's Bob Dylan's role.
Well, several successful albums and some artistic accomplishments more than you or I. So let us not, discuss who's fluffing who at this point.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm not a fan of Bob Dylan. Okay. So
yes, and that's why you fail. Okay.
Well. Anyway, we were talking about. We landed on the subject of the poem "The Wasteland." And you had mentioned that Dylan had mentioned both T.S. Eliot and Pound, that they were getting into some scrap or something like that in some lyric of his. And I mentioned the fact that Pound came up with the title "The Wasteland," which, by the way, it is a wonderful title. It is one of the great titles of the English language, I would think. And severely edited it. And I started thinking to myself, where exactly does the editor's job end and the artist's begin, if you will? Because there's always been this controversy about Gordon Lish and how he edited Raymond Carver into really a very different kind of writer. Because if you notice the later part of Raymond Carver's career, where his stories became more garrulous and more ornate, farther and farther away from that clean, minimalist style originally, it was because Raymond Carver had the editorial freedom to do so, because early on in his career, in order to get published, he had to toe the editorial line that Gordon Lish had set for him. So, people have noticed that Raymond Carver is two different authors, the early Raymond Carver and the later Raymond Carver, and there are fans of both. But most fans consider the early stuff better, and that was because of Gordon Lish's editorial hand, his very heavy and firm editorial hand. So I wonder, at what point does the editor become the co-author? I think that this is a legitimate question, by the way.
Right. I guess it always kind of, the first question is, the answer to the first question to my mind is, it depends. But to me, the important second question is, does it really matter? Mm-hmm. As to the first thing, when does it or doesn't? I say it depends because it's to suggest that there's like a line that once crossed, you're in co-author territory. It's just hard for me to envision. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it's like at what, almost like at what point do you go from like having a heap of sand to like a few grains of sand? Right. In your hand, kind of thing. Yeah. It's a matter of perception, I suppose. Yeah. And even because you could take this to the next level. For example, I forget who the editor was. I think it was the editor who helped translate Remembrance of Things Past into English. I forget his name. Mm-hmm. He may have been editor to. I forget his name, but I think he was like Gore Vidal's editor in a few of his books.
Yeah.
And I think Gore had said, say what?
Moncrief?
Yes, Moncrief.
Yeah.
And I think Gore had said, like, he edited my book. Apparently, did some significant edits, but Gore said I really couldn't tell what he edited. In fact, all I could tell is that it just seems to work better. So if that's a case where someone was pretty heavy in terms of their editing, but if you don't really perceive them, and it's all kind of just this allows Gore's original message to come across more clearly, then it's like a ghost in the machine type of situation at that point.
Yeah.
Whereas with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, I think is heavily influenced or heavily restructured by Ezra Pound. I think mostly through edits out as opposed to additions, if memory serves how that process went.
Okay, I'm unfamiliar with it, so I can't give an opinion.
And then there's another. I mean, and I can speak to myself as someone who helped someone edit. Not in any substantial way. I've had friends who are writers, and they've had me help edit them. I try as hard as possible to be non-interventionist in the sense of I'm not trying to say, well, this is how I would have written the story. Here's my take on the story you're trying to tell. It's more or less, okay, I know what you're trying to say. Let me figure out the best way that you could have said that. And so I will, say, you don't need this. This is kind of confusing your main point. And I ask them questions. Is this what you're trying to say, or is that what you're trying to say? And my editorial suggestions will vary as a result. You really won't notice me, but I am there.
Right.
And I think a lot of editors try to function that way.
Yeah, I mean, that would be in the ideal world, the Platonic ideal. An editor sort of like, asks you the questions to sort of like focus you in on what you really want to say. Because there are lots of times when you write scenes or do stuff that is just long-winded and goes all over the place when you're trying to make a specific point. And eventually you light on the answer that you're trying to give, the thing that you're trying to say. But sometimes that process can be awfully long, and a good editor can sort of like say, okay, these 20 pages, can't you cut it down to like 2 pages about this, and that, and leave it at that? And you're like, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to do. That's why I wrote the goddamn 20 pages, because I couldn't quite see how to do it in 2 to 3 pages, But the editorial relationship, I've always found it a little bit weird, because ultimately an editor is serving. I'm not so sure if he's trying to hone the writing and make it quote unquote better. I think he's trying to make it more sellable. I think that ultimately that's the goal, isn't it?
Well, I mean, when it's a business production, yes, in theory that should be the case. I don't think every editor truly believes that way. I mean, especially when there's a period, in the past when the industry is kind of set, as kind of healthy. And for example, I presume, I'm trying to come up with a good example. This isn't a good one, but let's just use it for the sake of argument. Let's presume, it's a John Updike book. We all know John Updike books are going to sell enough to warrant the case. Yeah. So the editor in editing isn't really in a position to worry, if I make the right edits, this is going to sell more. It's going to sell what it's going to sell.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I say it's a bad example because I know John Updike refused to let anybody really edit him.
Actually, I heard a different story altogether about that.
What did you hear?
Well, I heard that specifically some editor at the New Yorker, I think, got a story of his and underlined a couple of sentences and Updike, and later Updike. I mean, he was like in his 60s, and he sort of like mulled it over and said, "Oh yeah, you're right. Let me try and rewrite this," and he did rewrite it and rewrote it better. And I thought that was pretty remarkable. I mean, that wasn't really representative of him. I saw interviews with his actual editor of his books, and that basically what happened was you could gently coax him into thinking certain ideas, and he might say you have a point here. But if I think he was publishing at Knopf. Yeah. At the end, or Farrar, Straus and Giroux, one or the other. Yeah. And whichever one was with him first. Knopf. Well, whichever one was with him first, one of the editors got a little bit too, direct, like you got to do this, that, and the other, and they lost the relationship with him as a result of that. Really? So yeah. So yes, there could very well be an example of some
light coaxing that happened at the New Yorker, and maybe just because it's the New Yorker, because he was such a faggot for the New Yorker, he would just allow for it.
Yeah,
a little bit.
But when did he have this falling out with his editor?
Early on. It must have been early on.
Yeah, it must have been early on. Yeah, because he was at Knopf for decades. I mean, it was his publisher,
and he had the same editor there for decades.
Yeah.
I forget her name. It was a woman, I can't remember, but she was very adamant on like what he would and would not allow the editor to say.
Yeah,
and the editorial process, because he was. I mean, remember, this is a man who's so meticulous in his detail that to him, he would probably respond to the editor as an interventionist figure who doesn't know what the fuck he's really thinking about, as opposed to, let's say, someone who's maybe more of a hack and probably is fine with it because it just saves a little bit of thinking effort on the matter. In other words, I'm pretty sure, your pulpy guys like Grisham and Tom Clancy, when he was alive, were probably perfectly fine with the editor doing all their shit. It's like, you go think about it. I'll go to the links.
Well,
and finish up my golf game.
I know for a fact that Jack Higgins, who I believe is dead, check to see if he is dead, because I don't want to say something that I could be sued for. Is he dead or not? I heard a story.
Jack Higgins is still alive.
Oh, okay. So, then forget about him. Forget I ever mentioned his name. I'll talk about some random thriller writer that you have never heard of, but who sold quite a bit of copies. And one time he delivered like a 60-page manuscript, and his editor basically rewrote it until it was a 250-page manuscript, and they published it. And because Jack Higgins just didn't feel like it. And I mean, no, not Jack Higgins, just some random. Oh man, I'm gonna have to cut this out.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we all know it's not really Jack Higgins. It's Back Biggins.
Back Biggins, yeah. That's the story I heard. Okay, that an older writer who just didn't feel like it anymore. Who didn't feel like he was successful enough, he sold enough, and it was just one more book. So he was like, screw it, I've got a nice vacation set up. I'm not gonna bother writing more. And it seems to me that that's what, not hacks, but people who are very comfortable in their careers, and it's kind of depressing, because even with Updike, and I'm sort of like a fan of his. My relationship with him is ambiguous, I suppose, because what happens is that I think that he's a beautiful writer, but he wrote about things that I find inconsequential, and you have to admit that there are some books of his that were just so awful. And you have to ask yourself, wasn't there somebody in his life who said to him, don't publish this. This is garbage. I think
the cases of that are few and far between, to the point where, I just bypass them. There's very few books of his that are that bad. Mostly they were the later era books.
Yeah, the later era books that were just, come on, man. Okay. He should have just stuck to nonfiction then, because his nonfiction was very on point. He said things that were coherent. But if your fiction is just a little bit foolish, right? Remember that one, the one that David Foster Wallace made fun of justifiably, At the End of the World? What was it called? The War at the End of the World or something like that?
I forget, but the book that I remember people making fun of was Terrorist or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Which was about like a half Arab, half Irish terrorist.
Yeah.
Who just happens to be in a New England idle town. Of course he would be in a John Updike story.
I mean, it's like, for instance, that so far as the pitch is concerned, it's not awful, but it just didn't pull it off. That's kind of depressing. But I don't see.
It's like not everyone's going to hit him out of the park, but there's the other thing I've also encountered with editing, which happens rarer but is no less interesting, is when you're in a position where you really have to kind of almost make it from scratch for the author.
Yeah.
So obviously the Wasteland isn't necessarily this extreme, but it comes close. But I'm thinking of two examples in particular. One's recent, actually. You mentioned David Foster Wallace. What was the last book that was posthumous. It was like, what was it? The something.
Oh
King?
yeah, that's sad. That's sad when they try to scrape together a few more shekels from the scribblings of a dead author. You know, they did it to Hemingway. They published like a bunch of crap that Hemingway didn't want published in his lifetime. Okay, and I just find that just so disrespectful.
From what I gather with this one, when Foster Wallace hung himself, I got the story I got was that he actually printed out the pages he had completed and had them like neatly in a pile next to him, suggesting that, you know, I want you to do something with this. But it was really, you know, sections and bits and pieces, not in any particular order, and the editor kind of had to figure it out for the author at that point. And that's not even the first time that's happened. Like Naked Lunch is another example where William Burroughs was so hopped up and so fucked up that Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg had to really structure it. I mean, there's still a very good book.
Yeah, but he was alive. Okay,
he was alive, but it's the story remains the same. You do have these instances where the editor kind of has to find the story for the
author. Yeah, well, then it seems to me that he's drifting into the land of co-authorship. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. Yeah, sure. Would I read a book by William Burroughs or a novel by Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs? You know, the second actually seems more appealing, to tell you the truth. But look, what I find disrespectful, and I don't, how can I put this? See, when you die, okay, you have to think to yourself that as an editor, that the author, he could have published the shit that is left in some trunk. If he didn't publish it, there must be a very good reason. Like Mikhail Bulgakov, right? He wrote The Master and Margarita, undoubtedly a major novel, and arguably the major novel of his career, that he wrote and put away in his trunk because he knew that the political situation was such that he could never publish it, at least not during his lifetime. That's different because the guy wanted to have it published, but he knew that the political circumstances were such that he could not publish it. But like, for instance, a lot of the stuff that was posthumously published by Hemingway, that's stuff that he wrote and he said, nah, this is just, you know, shit, and I'm just going to leave it there. I'll leave it there so I can like look at it once in a while and figure out maybe I can do something with it or who knows what. I mean, lots of times, you know, you'll do some work on something and then, you know, figure that it's not working and just put it away. But then later you might come back to it and say, oh yeah, now I know how to fix it and rewrite it and make something good out of it. That happens all the time. But the idea of, okay, the guy died, and so we're going to publish all this shit, even if we like quote unquote edit it, you know, to, you know, spritz it up a little bit, it's still like, why? I mean, apart from the money grab, I see no reason to do so.
No, I think the best case against that, why? Because this is, you know, the whole question of should you respect the author's wishes and only do what they want. The case against it that you always say, well, sometimes is Kafka. Yes, Kafka, if you had left Kafka to his own devices, you would have gotten nothing.
Yeah. But also there's the thing that a lot of people say that Kafka made this request of, what was his name? Max Brodsky? Brodsky was his name?
I don't think it was Brodsky. I'll look up who his editor was.
Yeah, but it was his best friend who was a huge fan of his work. And as Kafka is dying, he tells this to the guy, and the guy says, "You don't want this because I'm the last person on earth who would ever follow your dictum, your request." And so yeah, it was made, but it was not a for real request. It's sort of like a suicide-like gesture as opposed to an actual suicide attempt, because he asked the one guy who would never do that. Okay. Because there are other people who would have done it, and would have had no compunction about doing it. So no, I don't buy that insofar as Kafka is concerned.
But that already kind of opens up the Pandora's box that you already have. It's like, well, he said it, but it's obvious he didn't mean it. So the whole question of what does he really mean, and his words really, and don't really matter. You're already opened up the door. So you might as well just say, well, whatever, que sera, sera, whatever will be. Because they've, sometimes they've done it in less than for less than good ideas. For example, another author who was subjected to this recently was Vladimir Nabokov. He had one of his last sketches that he was working on. It wasn't anywhere near completed.
Yeah.
I forget the title of it, but
Adele?
No. As he would write on index cards, just kind of like rough ideas. Eventually, it would get transmuted into a book.
The original of Laura. The original
of Laura, yeah, and it was like a few hundred, maybe like 150 index cards.
Yeah, nothing.
And his son, who by and large always said, like, I'm not going to do anything about it, I'm not going to publish it in any way, suddenly said, like, well, I had a dream that I was talking to Dad, and Dad said, well, do whatever the fuck you want, kind of thing. And
he had a dream of his dad, and he woke up to a meeting with his stockbroker.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even then, it's not like the Nabokov estate is particularly, bereft of funds.
Oh, yeah.
The back catalog does very well for itself.
I'm sure that that back catalog must be raking in. If I had to guess, I'd say between $500,000 and $1.5 million a year. Yeah, that sounds about right. Insofar as sales of Nabokov, that range. Yeah. So anyway, I'm sorry, you were saying?
So he brought it up, and like it was the bad part about it. It was so slight, and Nabokov always said, like, this isn't anywhere near in like shareable way, but they did a gimmick out of it. Like the book had all of the text on actual printed paper, but then they had punch-outable index cards you could punch out of the page, so you could shuffle it like Nabokov would do. It became a whole fucking gimmick. So less than stellar, but at the end of the day, you could at least say to yourself, well, I was kind of curious to, like, what was the in-between process that Nabokov had. I don't think it diminishes Nabokov by any means to say, oh, we saw some of your rough notes.
No.
This proves that you were a slighter artist. Like, no, it doesn't.
That doesn't work that way. Yeah. Yeah. I think that incomplete work, when published, doesn't really affect an author. I wonder what kind of incomplete work does affect an author. Because the only thing I can imagine if you had, because T.S. Eliot, for example, it has this reputation now. Part of the reason they hate him is because they suspected he harbored anti-Semitic ideas. I mean, they suspected
he had anti-Semitic ideas.
I mean, he was an outright anti-Semite, wasn't he?
He never really officially said so. But needless to say, I can imagine if you pull out like his old notebooks. Actually, I take it back. This did happen. I'll give you an even better example. Philip Larkin.
Yeah, what about him?
What basically happened to Philip Larkin's, all his poems came out, and then what happened after he died, people got a hold of his private journals, published those. And that was, let's just say the alt-right would like him.
Oh, he was our kind of guy?
He was harder than ours, even. Like,
really?
There was, he really hated black people. There was even, like, drunken recordings people found of him with his girlfriend, talking about, locking up or, like, smashing or doing something bad to the niggers. That was, like, the lyric.
God.
And it was, it came out at the wrong time. And Martin Amis is, because Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis, Martin's father, were very close friends. Martin is very protective of Philip Larkin as a result of, what came out. But yeah, that's an example of something that really happened. Where, if you do publish, some in-between or stuff that should never be shared,
diaries are different. Diaries are different. You publish diaries, and that's like the uncensored you. Oh man, I have like a stack of diaries that I've kept off and on over the years, and they are to be burned because I want to be able to look back on my own diaries and recall what I was thinking about certain things at certain times in my life. But I don't want those notes to be made public under any set of circumstances. I don't think anybody would care about them. But no fucking way, because it's just my shit. It's just my private thinking, And a lot of times, in a diary, you'll go overboard and vent in a way that you can't and wouldn't in real life. And you don't want that venting to be taken as actual. You see what I'm saying?
Here's the other nature of an editor, right? The editor is in a position to help you figure out what is your public
right.
face,
Yeah.
right? And people, I'm sure at face value, some people are going to say, "Well, are you just talking about something like Hillary Clinton, where you have, you say one thing in public, but you really mean something in private?" And my response is no. Oftentimes, what happens is the private thoughts, the private discussions are your in between rough notes.
Yeah.
And it's an exercise in fully articulating what you mean. And the editor is there to help you realize that. Because I think what often happens, especially on the internet, people should appreciate this. Your hot takes, your initial talking through with someone, you'll say some crazy shit that you probably even don't know necessarily believe. You're just trying to articulate what exactly it is you believe.
Yeah.
And in the intermediate process, you just say a bunch of just blah, shit, what have you. But that's how people operate, right? They say a bunch of shit. Eventually, they figure out what they really mean.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in our age, people think like, oh, that's what you really think. It's like, no, it's not what you really think. That's what you were trying to figure out what the fuck you meant.
Yeah.
So I think people try to hang themselves with that intermediate position. And the thing about the editor is the editor, in the best case scenario, should be the person there has your best interest at heart and trying to say, I'm going to help you figure out what that end state is and try to figure out what you really meant and saying it in a way that you really wanted to mean it. Right.
Yeah.
And that's a scary position to be in, because you have to put a lot of faith in the editor that the said editor has your best intention at heart. And they don't always do. And that's the other problem I think you have to worry about with editors, because I feel like the tendency is there, even though, like I said, I've never done it, but I suspect because I worried about it, some other people have done it, which is, to what extent does the editor vicariously become a writer through you?
I think it's to a great extent, actually, because to be a successful writer, you have to have certain qualities that are not the same qualities that you need for a successful editor. But I would guess that most editors come to become a professional editor by way of thinking that they might be a writer. I know for a fact that I've talked to a few editors who have told me that outright, that they took creative writing classes and crap like that, figuring that, oh, maybe I want to be a writer. And then they realized, I don't want to be a writer because I'm not good at it. I don't have the patience. I don't have this or that or the other to be a writer. But I like being around writers, or I like being around writing and publishing. I find it interesting. And they gravitated towards publishing. That's a very common situation. There are some editors who do become writers, like E.L. Doctorow, which is, he's the only one I can think of offhand.
I think Toni Morrison was too.
T.S. Eliot, he famously rejected George Orwell. You know that story, right?
He's a little bit. Was he an editor or was he a publisher? I know he was a publisher.
Editor.
I don't know that he's fully an editor. Okay.
Yeah. And so, he rejected, I think, Animal Farm.
Toni Morrison also was an editor. I remember that.
Yeah, I can't recall if T.S. Eliot rejected. I think he rejected Animal Farm. Yeah, because I think that he would not have rejected 1984, because by that time Animal Farm would have been out already and it was a successful novel. So it would have been idiotic for him to have rejected 1984, and especially because 1984 is a superior novel to Animal Farm. So well, I don't know if it's superior, but commercially it would have been worth his while. I think he rejected Animal Farm. Toni Morrison, she was an editor at, I think it was Farrar, Straus and Giroux. I've always thought to myself that Toni Morrison's reputation was an insider job, that publishing decided we like her and so we're going to push her up, but that she herself intrinsically does not have much to bring to the table. And I've always thought that, okay, there are certain artists where the industry seems to elevate them, but they themselves would not have been elevated without the industry. I think of Jonathan Franzen. I think of like certain rock bands, like Belle and Sebastian, for example. They're always been my bugaboo. I've never understood why people like them, but everybody always said that they were so great, so terrific, so this, that, the other. And I thought that they were crap. I think that Toni Morrison is kind of like a crappy writer. I mean, just she's just sort of like transposed Gabriel Garcia Marquez to the Deep South, and in not an interesting way, not the way that Garcia Marquez interestingly transferred Faulkner to South America, But there always seems to be like industry darlings, if you will, that get elevated, but that intrinsically they don't have many qualities. Does this make any sense to you?
Well, I mean, you're kind of preaching to the choir. I certainly don't really look kindly on Toni Morrison. I mean, I also think the fact that she was an editor first is not surprising, given that, to your point, she really takes bits and pieces of other writing and tries to work it in as her own. It always also makes sense, just given how heavy-handed her books are. Like, everybody seems to love Beloved, but the imagery in Beloved is so kind of on the nose and over the top that you just kind of say, oh, okay, she's doing the, this is the theme passage now. This is really saying something. Like when, I think the scene some people will remember is when they're eating the placentas, right? You remember that? Yeah. Pepperidge Farm remembers.
No, what does the expression "on the nose" mean to you? I'm kind of curious.
On the nose means it's much too obvious and a little bit too loud, as it were. So, if I were to, like, let's say you're writing some sort of story about, I don't know, guilt and crime and whatnot. If you have a feeling when you're reading it that says, oh, this is the passage where the author's making it very clear what his moral position is through symbolism, okay, that's on the nose. That's, you see too much of the mechanics behind everything.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Yeah, it's not being like the right thing at the right time. It's just what's expected. I'm trying to define it because I'm trying to figure out when is a piece of art effective and when is it quote unquote on the nose and therefore dismissible. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, if you start getting the impression that it's based on the lessons of a high school writing class, I think that'd be a good indication that you're probably on the nose.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But what would be like too obvious? Like too?
Frankly, I actually think Animal Farm is too on the nose at times. Like even though I think the language is nice, I think all pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than others. And then at the image at the end of pigs were dancing with men, and in the twilight one can neither tell between pig and man, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
That's very much on the nose. Like, I know exactly what he's trying to say there. There's no hint at interpretation.
Yeah.
There's just, this is Orwell's message. It's blunt, and there you go.
Yeah.
I also think that's partly why I have more fondness for Aldous Huxley's dystopian vision as opposed to Orwell's. Orwell's always just felt too blunt. Right? Yeah. Huxley was just a little bit more sophisticated.
Yeah, well, as we discussed when we talked about those two novels, Huxley was indecisive. He didn't know what kind of novel he was actually writing when he wrote Brave New World. And that's what makes it so exciting, because he kept changing his mind as he was writing it. As opposed to Orwell, when he was writing 1984, he knew exactly what kind of book he was writing. And also, there's something to be said about Animal Farm. Animal Farm was published, I don't remember when. I mean, Orwell died in 1948, right? So he must have written it in the 45 or 46. I'll look it up. But the point I'm trying to make is that the book, it was published in 1945, by the way. Animal Farm was, like bleeding edge at the time. Now, it's more the novel in and out of itself had such a huge impact culturally and socially, and insofar as a political vision of what the Soviet Union was. Because do keep in mind, at that time the Soviet Union was an ally of the West, fighting Nazi Germany, right? So you could say that it might be on the nose today, but at the time it might have been more revelatory than we today would see it as. Does this make sense to you?
Well, I mean, define revelatory, because I'm actually looking at the T.S. Eliot rejection letter.
Mm-hmm.
and his, he has a point. He's like,
what date was it, by the way?
The rejection letter was from July 13th, 1944. And by the way, I was right. He was a director, Faber and Faber at this time. And he even says in the letter, he was, it wasn't an editor. It was two directors had to give an opinion on that. But anyway, he said, as well as sympathy with his objections to some things and the positive point of view, which I take to be generally Trotskyite, is not convincing. I think you split your vote without getting any compensation, stronger adhesion from either party, i.e. those who criticize Russian tendencies from the point of view of a pure communism and those who, from a very different point of view, are alarmed about the future of small nations. After all, your pigs are far more intelligent than the other animals and therefore the best qualified to run the farm. In fact, there couldn't have been an animal farm at all without them. So that what was needed, some might argue, was not more communism, but more public-spirited pigs. It's very hard to kind of figure out what exactly his criticism was, but I think you get between the lines. He understands the parable behind the story. It's not, it's not a mystery. And I don't think it's truly revelatory. I think it's just parabled in such a way as you feel a little bit more comfortable talking about it. Just like, for example, in Star Trek, right? Mm-hmm. The episode of, the two aliens who are fighting each other, but they have like racial hatred towards each other. It's like, I'm black on the right side. Lokai is black on the right side. Therefore, he is, a lesser species. Right. It's not like, yes, it's transposed to an alien world, so you can talk about it more comfortably. But it's not like, oh, I wonder what they mean. What's the meaning behind that? Yeah. There's a subtext here that I just can't quite penetrate. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't remember what we were originally talking about when I brought that up, but it was the whole point about whether or not something was on the nose.
Yeah.
My suspicion is that it was on the nose at the time. For things like that, books like that are meant to particularly, pierce something. Mm-hmm. You can't, you don't really pierce something too subtly. It's like you make your big ass statement and you kind of hope to God that people respond to it. In a way, 1984 is a lot like Uncle Tom's Cabin in that regard. There's the artistry. Yes, you could say it's there, but it's not entirely functioning from artistry, right? Let's not kid ourselves. It has its political point to make.
What, Uncle Tom's Cabin? Yeah, it was
Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the totally same thing
political.
And same thing with Animal Farm. Animal Farm absolutely feels like Uncle Tom's Cabin level work.
But let me ask you the following question then. Can a virulently political work be literary?
Yes. That's I don't even think that's controversial. Mm-hmm. But I think, when you're so overt about it, you intentionally are making a trade-off decision in terms of, I can either do this very subtly and the message won't necessarily be apparent, but if you're observant, you'd find it. Or you say to yourself, the message is more important than the artistry, so I'll make things just more obvious and more to the point and aggressive than perhaps even, the style would, say might be the best way to do it. So, I think that's the trade-off that people make.
Well, I'll tell you why I'm asking, because, see, this is a thing I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about starting a novel, to tell you the truth. And starting a novel that would be sort of political and talk about the political problems that we're facing today. And I'm wondering, how subtle to be, or to be on the nose and just say, fuck it, just be blunt about the political issues going on. And just rely on, decent writing and decent language to elevate it artistically. Because I want to make something that I can be proud of. Something that is not just a hack job, and something that's not just a kind of on the nose, on the money, Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of thing. Because, we can all agree that Uncle Tom's Cabin is an important book historically, but we can all agree that it's not a great piece of literature. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, I would argue that.
Yeah. And so, to do something that is, on the nose insofar as themes and ideas, and yet at the same time, because there is this tension of like, if you're going to be talking about things that are political, you want to be on the money. You want to be hitting your political notes. But at the same time, there's always this sense that, oh, if you're going to go political, then you're going Uncle Tom's Cabin as opposed to Ulysses. I mean, if we put like, you know, I have my problems with Ulysses. You know, you and I have discussed it multiple times. I think that on the stream as well. But if you're going to be like doing the extremes between extreme artistry, Finnegan's Wake, and extreme politics, Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, there is that tension, or there is that perceived tension. Can you square the circle, or must you go one way or the other way?
No, you can square the circle. It's just that it depends on how you articulate and how you think of the problem. Mm-hmm. If you think the problem, the politics, is just a sequence of policies that you have issues with, it becomes very dull very quickly, mm-hmm. right? You can easily see yourselves going to Uncle Tom's Cabin. But if you recognize the problems, even if they are political, if you recognize that, you know, what's the underlying impetus for it, what's the underlying sickness in the society that you're trying to address, then you actually kind of do bridge those circles. And I'm thinking in particular of Dostoevsky's writing, and I think, you know, Notes from the Underground, whether he intended it or not, has implications on politics. Same thing with Joseph Conrad's novels.
Well, demons certainly, like demons, artistic and political at once.
And also for like almost everything Joseph Conrad, like Under Western Eyes. You
know, I've never read Joseph Conrad. I mean,
Heart of Darkness is...
Heart of Darkness, I know so much of Heart of Darkness, you know, because of Apocalypse Now and all the rest of it, that it's almost as if I'd read it, but I have not actually sat down and read Joseph Conrad. I just never got around to it, you know. I hope that doesn't make me a complete ignoramus.
Well, it may very well do that, but one can always absolve oneself of the sins of the past. No, they're good. I mean, it's when someone can write that well in their third language, you give them credit.
Yeah.
You know, but this also happens in the writer you like quite a bit. I would say Ernest Hemingway's books regarding the aftermath of World War II, or mm-hmm. dealing anything with Spain.
Yeah.
There's a political point of view to his writing, mm-hmm. but you know, I think he recognized that there's something, the politics is a symptom of something more fundamental. And I think when you do that, you can square that peg. You can, you know, reach your higher point of view, because at the end of the day, you're trying to document the human condition in one way, shape, or form. You have many tactics to do it. I think if you reduce yourself to anger over certain policies and treat them as such, you end up with your Uncle Tom's Cabins, and you know, you're just like, it's almost like, well, I'm going to write a column in book form, right? But if you see that fundamentally underneath them, almost like the iceberg layer or iceberg theory, right? Underneath what is predicating your problems with the politics of the world, it's, you know, there's a pain in the human spirit, or a pain in the human nature, or some sort of existential funk. Like I said, like Dostoevsky did, like Joseph Conrad understood, like Ernest Hemingway understood, then you actually do produce great work.
No, I see your point. Let me rephrase it this way. What happens, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the story, the actual plot, is highly political. It's about escaped slaves, right? But like Ernest Hemingway's novels are not that overtly political.
No.
You know? I mean, there's a distancing effect in his artistry that, precisely because of that distancing effect, makes it more quote-unquote artistic. Or am I reading too much into it? Can you have a novel that is blatantly, the plot is blatantly political and be artistic at once? Contingently political and yet be artistic?
I'm thinking it through it, so that's why I haven't uttered a lot of syllables at this point. But I am thinking, I haven't completed reading it yet, but arguably I'm looking at my stack. because they came in finally, of Gore Vidal's American History saga.
Yeah.
6 or 7 books, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking to myself, I know what he's depicting. He's depicting the ultimate decline of American Republic into empire and into basically a ready-to-die society on some level. That is political on some level. I mean, it deals with actual political decisions made over time, right? But it does have a distancing effect too, right? I mean, you're dealing with, how certain people exhibited themselves in this era, how they came to the decisions and how it kind of wounded or scarred them. So one asks yourself, and to be fair, I haven't read all the books, so I can't tell you how effective it is. But you ask, like, well, is it overtly political? Does it have its clear political point? Yes. But is it also distanced a little bit just by virtue of, one, being historic, 2, occupied with the peripheral, fictional characters around it who have just lives that they lead? Yeah, probably. So, it's one of those things where, again, it's like a clear demarcation line. It's probably not going to be readily apparent to you. And let me actually point out another example that is, like I said, I've said this to people. I think it's overtly political. You can't understand it without an understanding of the politics, yet it's objectively strong art. And it's not a book, it's a film, and it's the Battleship Potemkin. Battleship Potemkin is one of the most effective pieces of film you will find. It's an early piece of film. It's partly the reason why it's effective. It uses techniques to, absolute stellar ends, but, it's still a work of art. I would even go so far as to say something even more controversial amongst our crowd. Well, maybe not amongst our crowd, but broader. Triumph of the Will absolutely is an artistic work of art. It sounds so silly. No question. But it's also, let's not pretend like there's no politics in Triumph of the Will.
No.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, like there is an example of a piece of art of astonishing power. The thing is also, Leni Riefenstahl, man, she really knew what she was doing when she filmed. And also, there's something else. See, we look at Eisenstadt and we say, well, he was an early filmmaker, so he invented a lot of techniques that might have been developed by other people. I mean, yeah, okay, fine, I'll grant you that. But the thing is, see, by the time that Leni Riefenstahl was doing her pictures, filmmaking was an established art form. It had been going on for a couple of decades of really extraordinary artists who had done extraordinary work. I mean, I'm thinking, the one about the Ku Klux Klan, right? The Birth of a Nation, Metropolis, Battleship Potemkin. Okay, I mean, these movies were artistically extraordinary, and Leni Riefenstahl comes along and does this. And it's so goddamn funny because, the Me Too movement, they keep talking about women and women in films and shit like that. Well, here you go. Leni Riefenstahl, indisputably a genius. I mean, you cannot say that Leni Riefenstahl was not a genius filmmaker, because she was, like it or not. And Triumph of the Will and Olympia. Oh my God, I don't know if you've ever seen Olympia. That is extraordinarily beautiful.
Olympia is very good. I mean, and the funny thing is, to all you people out there in the world who think like, oh, I can't bring myself to enjoy a Nazi movie. It's like, well, your Nazi movie scenes have already been incorporated into some of your favorite movies.
Yeah.
Not Star the least Wars. Of which is Star Wars. The ending of Star Wars is Hitler marching down the down the Nuremberg rally. It is shot for shot taken from it.
I can't believe that people didn't have a complete hissy fit over. Well, that shit today would not have flown. They would have.
What's funny is, like, at the time in the 70s, I mean, a point when left-wing politics wasn't absent, right, from people's mind. I mean,
certainly not.
You had Mick Jagger even said when he met Leni Riefenstahl, he just kept going on and on about how he loved Triumph of the Will.
Yeah. Yeah, well, because it's a great
And I
picture.
don't think it was because he wasn't saying like, oh, Lenny, I'm really a Nazi here, and I just need to tell you, fucking gas the Jews.
No.
Kind of thing. He was saying it's a fucking good film.
It is.
That's what he was responding to.
It was, yeah. I mean, I look at Triumph of the Will. Olympia, for instance, I don't quite understand why the gay subculture in the West has not adopted that movie wholesale, because it is very homoerotic. I mean, well, not homoerotic, heteroerotic, I would have supposed. I mean, considering that Leni Riefenstahl, she liked her men, you know, and when she was in her 80s, she kept a couple of little African boys that she'd boff whenever she felt like it, you know, and good on her, you know. But like, I can't quite understand why Olympia. It's so beautiful. The sequence I always think about whenever I think of that picture is of the twisting and turning divers, that they're like floating in air. You know, it's just extraordinary. It's an extraordinary picture. The only one that comes close is the Tokyo '64 Olympiad. You ever seen that picture? That's also very good, because it's a film about the '64 Olympics in Tokyo, but it shows everybody, but there's no winners. It's just the athletes, and they're randomly running, they're randomly doing their thing, shot with very long lenses most of the time. So they're in focus and everything is blown out. And it's really quite an achievement. I forget who did that picture. It's a really good picture. I saw it years ago, decades ago. I should watch again because I have very good memories of it. But Olympia was just so beautiful. Oh, man. And, well, Triumph of the Will. That notion of... I personally think that George Orwell got the notion of Big Brother from Triumph of the Will. Because that's the whole point of the book. All of the people are just masses of people, except Hitler. Hitler's face, his face is the only clear and distinct face in that entire picture. And everybody else is just a sea of faces, an ocean of people. That's an extraordinary achievement in propaganda, in filmmaking, in understanding film, in using Academy aspect ratio, the 3:4 aspect ratio, in a way that is just incredible, you know? The weird thing is that it's the one picture that would not have gained anything by being shot in 235 aspect ratio. It would not have looked more cinematic, you know? Because she composed her shots to perfectly fit that 3:4 aspect ratio. I'm going on and on like a total fanboy about the old lady, but, you know, and I lost train of thought.
Let's take it back to where we were talking about it. So my attitude, yes, you can even have an overtly political film achieve a level of artistic success, and not even just film. It could be a book. Books are harder, admittedly, but it could happen. But the challenge,
can I interject something? It's clear. It's clear that a film can be politically motivated and yet be artistic. Triumph of the Will, a case in point. And could we make the analogy that the visuals in a political film translate as the language in a novel, and the polished language of a novel can and the theme. The story or theme of the movie can translate as the theme or plot of the novel. Can we do that kind of like comparison and thereby say, sure, if your language is distilled and clean and pure enough, that's the wrong approach. I mean, if your language, your writing, is of a caliber. Sure, you can write a very overtly political novel that is at the same time an artistic achievement.
I would say what you described absolutely would work for poetry. Novels are a little bit harder, not because a novel is not composed of words, right? I mean, it is, but the sequencing of words in the right moment is certainly tied to poetry. Novels, you have to get a little bit into the ideas. The prosaic, is a harder nut to crack, in part because it isn't like a prose poem. You know what I mean? There is a whole notion of relationship between the reader and the depicted individuals. Mm-hmm. But I mean, as I'm thinking through this, there is another example where it's not overtly political, but it certainly has political overtones that are very obvious. Is Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. Yep. And it's a fictionalized book of sorts, but it is like almost like a memoir of sorts as well, of a soldier on the front in World War I. And amongst other things, it isn't about, war is hell. It was war is existentially invigorating, and it creates a situation where the individual knows who he is and what he's supposed to do at any given point in time. That is sort of it's a precursor to certain political ideologies.
What's the name of the novel again? Can you repeat?
Storm of Steel.
That I've never heard of that novel, to tell the truth, and that sounds something that I can get behind. I'm looking it up now.
Yeah, Ernst Junger, who was he lasted a long time. He decorated German World War I hero. He won the Pour le Mérite award, which is the highest German military honor you could win. He was I think he converted to Catholicism at the end of his life, but he was very much a arch conservative figure, religious thinker, existential thinker, critical of Nazis, but still a very hard right-winger.
So you're basically, I've never heard of this novel, and for all intents and purposes, it's the flip side of All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yes, it is.
This sounds a lot cooler, to tell you the truth. He sounds like a guy who's like, fuck it, I'm going to go and I'm going to fight, and I'm going to win, and I'm going to get something out of it.
Yes.
He sounds fucking cool, to tell you the truth.
Ernst Junger is a very interesting man. And Storm of Steel is a very interesting book. I'm sure a lot of our listeners already know it, but I'll just reiterate it if they don't. I also, because I'm partly feeling guilty because I know we spent so much time on left-wing artists that I felt like we neglected the right-wing guys, and I've had time to think about it.
Because I have never heard of this book. Okay, and yeah, because All Quiet on the Western Front, anti-war, and reaching out for the butterfly and dying, But yeah, this is my kind of book because it seems to even books like Sigurd Sassoon's Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, it looks at the war, just so down and yeah, we recognize there was a complete tragedy, okay, and frankly a pointless thing that I think the effects of World War I. It seems to me increasingly obvious that the suicide of Europe that we are witnessing is because of World War I, because all the strong men were killed. All the strong men and only the weaklings and the cowards survived to reproduce, and that's why we have the Europe that we have today. That's my thinking, to tell you the truth. And the more I think about it, the more obvious it is. But anyway, this book, I'd never heard of it, and I should have heard of it because it sounds fucking awesome. I'm reading the Wikipedia, and yeah, it's just like,
So I'll tell you actually where I first came across it. I actually first came across it in college during my class. That was the title of the class. I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember it exactly. It was more or less something like "To Hell with the Enlightenment." It was all of the anti-Enlightenment sort of academic and literary works that kind of came out in the aftermath of the like I said, the Enlightenment period, and particularly the French Revolution. Amongst other books that we would read, the Dialectics of the Enlightenment, George Herbert Mead's psychological theories, Hitler's Mein Kampf, obviously part of it, and this book. Yeah. And this book was, basically, flies its finger against, a conception of reality and what it means to be like a member of nations that, and people who care about each other. It says, no, conflict and existential doom are what invigorates the individual.
Yeah. No, because my own case, and I say this all the time in my videos, that the happiest times of my life were when things were going to shit. When things were going to shit and I was struggling to make it, to survive even. That was the happiest time of my life, retrospectively. At the time, it was a misery, but after the fact, it was like, fucking A, this was great. This was terrific. I felt alive, yeah, I think of all this, post-traumatic stress disorder shit and like, all this whining, and I'm fucking sick and tired of it. I mean, there cannot be, there must be some soldier out there in Afghanistan who's fucking happy. He's like fuck, man, this is great. I get to shoot shit and shoot people, and they're shooting back at me, and I might die. This is the best time of my fucking life. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's Colonel Kilgore, right? In Apocalypse Now, one of the great lines in that, if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. In the Martin Sheen narration, when he's talking about Kilgore, he says he's the kind of guy who no shit's gonna stick to him in this war. He's just gonna walk out.
Yeah, he had that weird glow about him, and you knew he wasn't get so much as a scratch. Yeah. I mean, but like Junger here, he was wounded 14 times in the First World War, including getting shot in the chest, right? Which a shot in the chest is nothing to laugh at. Okay, I mean, the
he's
guy,
tough cookie.
Yeah, a tough son of a bitch, right? Just a man's man. I mean, somebody that you can say, fucking A, I'm not going to mess with you, sir. I mean, no way. Because even, I'm looking at a picture of him when he was celebrating his 100th birthday, right? Even as a frail 100-year-old man, you're like, don't mess with him. I mean, do not, because there's like a thing, that you can tell, okay, just by looking at the guy. That, he was like a tough son of a bitch. And I think that is something that you're not born with. And I think that's something that I sort of like despise, that there's this notion that strength is something that you're born with, that you cannot aspire to it. And what you can aspire to is just being a fucking victim. I hate that. Ugh. Well, I'm ranting about something off topic. But you see what I'm saying? This crybaby attitude, like, all quiet on the Western Front, and I wanted to touch a butterfly, and then I got killed.
It says something about Ernst Junger that you had people on the right and left kind of revering him to a certain extent, or at the very least afraid of him.
Sure.
One of the other stories I liked about him was, obviously the right wing liked him, like Julius Evola liked him. He was friends with Martin Heidegger, what have you. But even in the 40s or 50s, I think when the German communists were thinking about fucking with him, Bertolt Brecht, the great Stalinist Bertolt Brecht, basically told the German communists, "You leave Junger alone."
Yeah,
and they didn't. So
how were they going to fuck with him? Like what? Assassinate him?
I have no idea. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Rough him up, talk shit. Who cares? They kind of like, we're going to have him in the crosshairs, and like, nope, you don't fuck with Ernst Junger. And even the Nazis didn't fuck with him.
Yeah. I'm reading about his period during the Third Reich, and said he served in World War II as an army captain. Wow. I mean, he must have been in his 40s. Because he was born in 1895. So during the war, he must have been mid to late 40s during the war. And the war ended in 45, so it would have been 50 at that time. And he assigned to administrative position in Paris. He socialized with prominent artists of the day, such as Picasso and Jean Cocteau. Good on him. His early time in Paris was described in a diary. Okay. Gardens and streets. He was also in charge of executing deserted. Wow. He executed deserters. Jesus.
He lived the life. Let's put it that way.
Junger had been interested in learning how a person reacts to death under such circumstances and had a morbid fascination for the subject. Holy shit.
Junger, when you read Storm of Steel, you'll understand why.
Yeah. Junger appears in the fringes of the Stauffenberg bomb plot. He was clearly an inspiration to anti-Nazi conservatives in the German army, and while in Paris, he was close to the old, mostly Prussian officers who carried out the assassination attempt against Hitler. He was only peripherally involved in the events, however, and in the aftermath suffered only dismissal from the army in the summer of 1944 rather than execution. His elder son, Ernst Jr., then a naval cadet, was imprisoned that year for engaging in subversive discussions in his Wilhelmshaven Naval Academy. Transferred to Penal Unit 999. He was killed near Carrara in occupied Italy on 29th November. That must have been tragic. To lose a son, especially when he's like a young man. That must be horrifying. Anyway, I'm definitely going to read Storm of Steel. I'd never heard of it. And that's the thing. Our education is so left-wing. We aren't taught I have not gotten around to reading Mein Kampf, though I have it. But what I've like skimmed through it, it's not the ravings of a lunatic. There are issues there. Yeah, sure, you can say that it's not that cleanly written or what have you. It's not, Kissinger's memoirs in terms of just polish and precision. But how could I put it? It's not insane, and that's the thing. That's the thing that bothers me so much about our leftist cultural, the left's cultural hegemony, that everybody right wing is crazy. That bothers me. There's that sense, and that's for a different argument, a different discussion, I suppose. So anyway, you want to call it a podcast?
Yeah, I think this is a good point in time to end. So at the end of the day, yeah, the question of editing is an interesting one. My attitude is it's regardless of whether it's unfair or not to the authors, you've produced some interesting things out of it.
Yeah.
And if by accident of this discussion we made everybody want to read Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, well, then the podcast was a success as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So I'll see to it that there's a link in the description so that you can check it out and read this book, because it seems very interesting, and I'm going to get around to reading it myself, to tell you the truth. Yeah. So with that being said, this has been the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill, signing off for my co-host. And as usual, on the podcast, I leave the final word to my esteemed co-host, Dr. Benway. What is your final word for today?
Bob Dylan is the man. To hell with your opinions otherwise.
Oh, cheap shot. I can't answer. Cheap shot. And with that, I bid you a fond farewell. Thank you very much. Take it easy.
Later.